Here is Ancient Charm number 16, October, a turquoise shimmering ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
At first, I thought this was kind of a blue, but this shimmering ink is certainly a turquoise. Even without the shimmer, we have a very nice tone on the page. There is a bunch of tone variation by pen, especially by how wet the pen is. It does shade, though often the shading gets hidden by the shimmer. A great thing about this ink is that if you're using it in a wet pen and it uses up the shimmer a little faster, you're still putting down a great tone on the page that you can enjoy. To help avoid this, just remember to turn the pen and keep that shimmer suspended while you're writing. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Duke 209.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, this certainly is the lightest tone that we're going to see. Now, the soft fine is a dry pen and it does tend to expose any weakness in flow that an ink might have, and I think it's showing a little here. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get shading, we do get shimmer. The shimmer seems to come through much better in the shaded areas where it gets darker, which isn't really a surprise, though I think it would have been cool to see some of the shimmer show up in some of those lighter areas. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it shimmers like a beast. The first couple lines are all shimmer all the time, making it really interesting because it changes to a kind of gold look depending on the angle that you're looking at it. Very interesting. As far as the shading that's coming through, yes, we do get shading. You see it in ground or others on the second line, where the U is a little darker than the rest of the word. The THE in others is darker than the letters that surround it. So we are getting the shading and the shimmer coming through very nicely. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has shading doing very nicely, I think. In what I get to see, I think this is really one of the better looks. And the shading is coming through very nicely. We see it in they, made, for, his. Every word has darker letters in it. Every word has spots that have decent amount of shimmer coming through. Very, very nice. And this paper, I think, really helps it pop even more. The broad nib is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium. Just a hair. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get the shimmer and we do get the shading that were both very present in the medium. I just don't think that the shading is showing up as well as it did on the medium, but it's a slight difference, and it would then become a matter of preference. But this ink, turquoise, isn't really my thing. I think it's doing fantastic. Probably that heavy blue lean to it. Looking at the back of the page, as we would expect, there's no bleeding, there's no ghosting. You can easily write back here. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 5 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. I think the more absorbent nature of the paper sort of helped with some of the flow issues in sucking some of that ink out into the paper. There's a tiny bit of spread, but there's no feathering, and it's, I think, again, that absorbent nature of the paper. We're still getting the shading. We're still getting some of the shimmer, not a ton of the shimmer. You see in the B of Bilbo, the first one, some shimmer there. On Scuttled, the LE has a tiny bit of shimmer. Almost nothing else. Everything else we get is little spots of shading, like the H in Fresh on the third line, or the B in But on the third line. Not huge in shading here, but it's doing fairly well. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was on, or with the soft fine. It is actually darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, we have no feathering, we have no spread, we have no shimmer. You can see the shimmers there. It's not shimmering when I look at it. It's just very dark, making it almost black whenever the shimmer's there. When the shimmer's not, we're getting a very dark turquoise, like where Busy Spinning Webs, the fourth line. So not really shading here. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shimmer, little bits of shading. Now, with some of the little bits of shading, you can see where the shimmer has really gone down, like the on the first line, where the he is a bit darker and shows that almost black kind of tone. The same with tree directly underneath it, the first E. So it's not shading especially well here. The shimmer's going on the page, just not showing well. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We do get some spread. We get some shading, a lot more shading than we had with the medium. The shimmer's not really showing as shimmer, but just as much darker areas, like the K in thick right up front. Round is a nice, mostly uniform tone, but the U at the end of it gets a bit darker. Same with the end of the D. Him, right next to that on the second line, goes from a lighter to a much darker tone at the M, and when the shimmer's coming through, very dark. Looking at the back of the page, most noticeably would be the wet fine, where it got very deep into the paper. I don't think if you were using a wet fine, you could write on the back of this page, but with the medium, broad, or soft fine, I think you definitely could. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath, but there is a fair amount of ghosting. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine and much more turquoise leaning as a result of the tone of the paper. No feathering, no spread, a little spattering of shading throughout. You see it on the I and S of insects on the second line. You see it on the L, K, E, and D on plucked on the third line. So you can spot areas with shading. The shimmer is wasted on this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading, with no shimmer, though you can see a lot of shimmer is getting onto the paper. It's just not shimmering. The paper itself seems to be kind of killing it. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. It is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is more turquoise showing than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, almost no shading, though we can spot a couple letters here and there, almost none. It's really the shimmer coming through. We do get a word of shimmer, fly, and the colon on the first line both have a lot of shimmer, making me feel like this paper has a potential occasionally of letting shimmer come through, but I wouldn't rely on that. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium, about the same tone as the Clairfontaine, we get feathering. Look at that on the first line. Lots of feathering the whole word over. Same with last space between. There's pretty much feathering the whole way through here. There is some spread that's going on. There's some moments of shading. The shimmer is not coming through, where at least on the medium we had one word of shimmer, we have none here. Looking at the back of the page, just like before, we have a lot of really heavy ghosting on most of the nibs. We have nothing that bled through and touched the page underneath, but we can see just how deep this really is getting into the paper.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We're not seeing any kind of flow issues like we had on the Clairfontaine. It's a different coating. And I think perhaps some of that got worked out as an issue on some of the non-fountain pen friendly papers. Now, we have some shading. You see it in strands on the first line where the A, N, and beginning of the D are lighter than the rest of the word. Hastily on the second line, the H is much darker than the AST, but the ILY darken up a bit. Trunk, mostly uniform tone. The K is a bit darker. I'm not seeing much shimmer come through, and it may have been used up out of the pen by this point. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get shading, which we did not have on the Clairfontaine. You really see the shading show up very well in the second and third lines of writing. A lot of words where off is much darker than singing right next to it. Sword underneath that, sword. I'm going to pronounce every letter when I read a word. Sword, the D is darker than the rest of the word, where though gets much darker right next to that. Shimmer, unfortunately, isn't coming through here. It's a lot of papers. I didn't rotate the pens. I might have used it up. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We get shading just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. I think we get more of a mix, halfway dark, halfway mid-tone on it, like them on the second line, where the T is a nice mid-tone, the HE is the dark tone, the M is the nice mid-tone again. Hurrying, the H is darker than the URR, but the Y darkens up quite a bit, lighten into the IN, and very dark at the G. So I think we're getting a lot of back and forth. No shimmer. Looking at the broad nib, we'll just go ahead and say I believe the shimmer's been used up out of all of these pens at this point. It is the same tone as the medium on this paper, which is just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. Yes, we have shading like nippers and spinners on the first line, where the P's are darker than the rest of the word in nippers, and is a nice mid-tone for the AN, darkens up at the down loop and the very top of the D, where spinners, the downstroke of the P is darker than the rest of the letter. Nice mid-tone through most of the word, very dark S at the end. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Diamine Marine. Here is Mont Blanc Blue Hour. Here is Organic Studios Nickel Teal. Here is Pelikan 4001 Turquoise.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. No, it does not have any shimmer. It does have shading. Not a ton of shading, little bit of shading. This paper is not known to bring that shading out, so any that does really come through is always a bonus. Look at then quieter than a mouse. Second line. The TH is darker than and it lightens in the E, much lighter at the end. Quieter, the Q is quite dark. It lightens up until it reaches the ET of quieter. Of course, I had to affix that part. Than has a darker H. Mouse, the OU is lighter than the MSE in that word. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It has no feathering, it has no spread, it has no shading, and no shimmer. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine nib, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. Yes, it does shade. You see it in suppose he would on the second line, where the P's of suppose are light or darker than the rest of the word. The he, 2 letters, 2 tones, too good to be true. Wood starts lighter and works its way darker till the LD. Now, as far as shimmer, there's obviously shimmer still in the pen because you can see it in branch where the bundles is showing that there was shimmer, though it is not shimmering on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get no shimmer, but we get some of the nicest shading that we've seen from this ink in all of its writing. This ink, no shimmer on this paper. Absolute winner. Look at though. The T is lighter than the H, and that H is very dark. Now the OU lighten up quite a bit. The G becomes a bit darker than that, and the H lightens up even further. Where his second line, you get hurt him, the H is darker than the I, and it stays light into the M, very dark at the end of the M. I think the shading we're seeing here isn't that it's the most shading. I think the way it's standing out is very nice and appealing to look at. Looking at the back of the page, as has been standard for this notebook, there's no bleeding and no ghosting. Easily continuing your notes, though preferably not with this ink, on the back of the page. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Private Reserve Rose Rage. Here is Diamine Caramel Sparkle. Here is Noodler's Mandalay Maroon. Here is Kayono Oto Yamabuki Iro.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. There is some feathering, there is some spread, there is no shimmer, there is no shade. I think it's a little more blue leaning on this paper than it was on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. Yes, lighter than on the Clairfontaine. Definitely lighter because we're certainly not seeing any shimmer come through. This paper's bound to just eat it up. A bit more turquoise leaning than it was on the Clairfontaine. Almost looks like it would be a different ink when you compare it to the soft fine. There is feathering, there is spread. I do think it's under control, and as long as this doesn't bleed through, I don't think it's the end of the world, just a waste of a shimmer ink on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's definitely much more of a turquoise here than it was in really any of the other writing. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. I want to say no, it doesn't shade. I only see a couple spots are a little bit darker. We'll say no, it doesn't shade, just to not have people built up for hoping for shading here. The shimmer doesn't come through. It's just an ink on the paper at this point.
Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers a whole bunch, the whole way, in fact. Yes, it spreads. Not the worst in the world. It doesn't look like you are writing with a marker, but it looks like you might be writing with a marker. There's a couple tiny moments of shading-ish. There's no shimmer that comes through. I would not use this broad nib on this paper with this ink. Looking at the back of the page, as has been the case with most of the non-fountain pen friendly papers, there's a ton of ghosting. You can't write back here. If you write back here, you're destroying your notes on both sides. However, nothing bled through touching the page underneath, meaning you could use it if you really had to.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine nib was the lightest tone, and being a dry pen really highlighted the potential of flow issues. The wet fine was the darkest tone and delivered the most consistent shimmer throughout, where the medium was lighter than the wet fine and darker than the soft fine, giving nice mid-tones with shading and shimmer throughout. The broad was just a tad bit lighter than the medium, but otherwise similar performance to the medium. So for me, I really preferred the medium flow, medium nib, as I feel it gave the best of everything that this ink has to offer. And I would really avoid it in any dry pen because I think there's that potential of flow issues with this ink. Now, in taking notes with that Fude nib, I think it looks amazing from that, where it's very wet and it's what you get to see at the moment.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.